The sonar screen flickered, a shadow in the deep, something that shouldn't be there. When the ROV lights hit the hull, the world held its breath. A ship, upright, perfect, as if it had just sunk yesterday. But this ghost had been waiting for over 150 years. The divers went in. They swam through silent hallways. They found the officers' mess. Plates were set for a meal that was never eaten. A bottle of wine, still corked, sat on the table. In the captain's cabin, a pair of glasses rested on an open book. The ink in the logbook was faded, but the last entry was chillingly normal. It spoke of the weather. It gave their position. Then it just stopped. The ship was a tomb, but there were no bodies, not a single one. And then, miles away, they found the other one, the second ship. The same impossible story. A perfectly preserved vessel abandoned in a hurry. Two ships, HMS Erebus and HMS Terror, the pride of the British Empire. Gone. 129 men vanished with them. These weren't rookies. They were veterans of polar exploration, hand-picked for the most important mission of the era. They were led by a legend, Sir John Franklin, a man who had stared into the white abyss before and returned. They were the best sailors, the best scientists, the best Marines the world's most powerful navy could offer. They were sent to solve the final puzzle of global navigation, the Northwest Passage, a mythical shortcut to Asia, a route that would make them rich and famous. They were supposed to return as heroes. Instead, they became ghosts. And they were prepared for anything, or so they thought. Their holds were packed with over 8,000 tins of food, salted beef, pork, and soup, enough to last for 3, maybe even 5 years if they rationed. Their ships were revolutionary, iron-plated bows designed to shatter ice fields, internal steam heating systems to fight the Arctic cold. They had a library of over 1,000 books to pass the long, dark winters. They had everything: technology, supplies, experience. So what happened? How does the most advanced expedition of its time simply cease to exist? For 2 years, the world heard nothing. Then the search began. Dozens of ships sailed into the ice, looking for a sign. They found scattered, terrifying clues. 3 graves on a desolate island from the first winter. The men had died, but the expedition had continued. Then a note tucked inside a pile of stones. It said they had been trapped in the ice for over a year and a half. It said Sir John Franklin was dead. It said the survivors were abandoning the ships to walk south across the frozen land. But it ended with a strange, almost insane message: all is well. It was the last official word ever received from the Franklin expedition. But there were other words, whispers, stories from the local Inuit hunters that the British Empire refused to hear. They spoke of seeing a long line of white men, thin and desperate, dragging a heavy boat across the ice. They said the men were starving, that they were acting strangely, their eyes were wild. They pointed to their own mouths and made gestures of eating each other. The Victorian public was horrified. They refused to believe it, not their heroes, not the Royal Navy. They dismissed the stories as savage lies. But the stories were true. The truth was far worse than a simple shipwreck or getting lost in the cold. The cold didn't just kill them, it broke them. It stripped away their discipline and turned them against one another. This isn't a story about ice and snow. It's a story about what happens when the rules of civilization disappear, and the only thing left is hunger and paranoia in the endless dark. The official record is a lie. This case defies all logic. To join us as we piece together the real story from the clues left in the ice, subscribe to the channel right now. We are about to uncover the single, fatal mistake that started it all. Their fatal mistake wasn't on any map. It wasn't a navigator's error or a captain's bad call. It was on their dinner plates. Those 8,000 tins of food, their shield against starvation, were a time bomb ticking in the ship's hold. They were supposed to be a revolution, a miracle of modern science that would conquer the Arctic. But the company that won the naval contract, Stefan Goldner, did it cheap, and they did it fast, too fast. In a grimy London factory, workers were paid by the piece. The more tins they sealed, the more they earned. Speed was everything. Quality was nothing. To seal the tins, they used a thick, lead-based solder. And in their haste, they were careless. They slopped it on, leaving jagged seams. Hot molten lead dripped down the inside of the cans, right into the salted beef, the pork, the vegetable soup. Every single meal was a dose of poison. It wasn't enough to kill them outright. No, the mistake was far crueler than that. It was a slow, creeping death that began in the mind. The lead poisoning was a ghost. It mimicked other diseases, turning the ship's doctor into a helpless spectator. He saw men with bleeding gums and swollen joints, and his medical texts screamed scurvy. He administered the standard treatment, lime juice, but the men only got worse. He saw sailors doubled over with crippling stomach pain, a violent colic that left them pale and weak. He blamed the cold, or perhaps a batch of spoiled meat. He had no idea he was fighting an invisible poison they were willingly eating 3 times a day. But the physical symptoms were nothing compared to what it did to their minds. The lead attacked their nervous systems. First came the fatigue, a bone-deep exhaustion that no amount of sleep could cure. Then came the confusion. Experienced sailors would forget simple knots. Junior officers would stare blankly when given a direct order. Their thoughts became a fog, and then came the rage. The poison eroded their impulse control. Men who had served together for years, who had trusted each other with their lives, now flew into violent rages over the smallest things. A spilled cup of grog, a perceived insult, a tool that was misplaced. The lower decks became a powder keg of paranoia and aggression. The doctor noted it in his log as melancholy or cabin fever, the psychological strain of being trapped in the ice and darkness. He was wrong. This wasn't psychology. It was chemistry. Their brains were being systematically destroyed by their own food. The officers were not immune. They ate the same poisoned meals, often in larger quantities. Their own judgment began to fail. They became irritable, forgetful, and prone to making irrational decisions. The strict discipline of the Royal Navy, the very foundation of their survival, began to crack. Men started whispering in the shadows. They accused each other of hoarding rations. They saw conspiracies in every corner. The ships, once symbols of British engineering and power, were transforming into floating asylums. The revolutionary steam heating system hissed and clanked, keeping their bodies from freezing, but it couldn't stop the cold from seeping into their minds. The library of 1,000 books sat untouched. No one had the concentration to read. The pages just blurred. When the ice closed in for that second brutal winter, it didn't just trap 2 ships. It sealed 129 men inside their own collective madness. They were no longer the pride of the Royal Navy. They were weakened, paranoid, and led by officers whose own minds were failing them. The mistake had been made thousands of miles away in a dirty London factory. But the price would be paid here, in the endless, silent dark of the Arctic. The poison had done its work. The chain of command was broken. Civilization was a distant memory. Now the real descent could begin. The sun vanished. For months there was only darkness, a twilight world of shifting ice and howling wind. The groaning of the ship's timbers became the only clock they had. The pressure ridges sounded like giants walking just beyond the hull. And then the whispers started. Men swore they heard voices carried on the wind. Names of wives and children from a world that no longer felt real. Others saw figures moving in the distance, dark shapes against the endless white. They were shadows, but they were watching. Food became the new religion. Rations were cut again and again. The tinned soup was a thin, greasy broth. The salted beef was hard as a rock, but it was all they had. Men would stare at each other during meals, counting every bite, every swallow. A man was caught hiding a biscuit in his bunk. They didn't report him to the officers. They dragged him onto the deck and beat him until he stopped moving. No one intervened. The officers were losing control. Captain Crozier, now in command after Franklin's quiet, unceremonious death, saw the madness taking root. He was a hard man, an experienced Arctic sailor, but the lead poison was in his veins too. His orders became erratic. One day he'd demand a full inspection of the sails, which were frozen solid and useless. The next he would sit in his cabin for hours, staring at a map that showed nothing but ice. The men no longer saw a commander. They saw a weak, confused old man. The sickness worsened. Men's teeth fell out. Their joints swelled to the size of fists. They would cry out in the dark, delirious with pain and fever. The doctor had run out of answers. He wrote in his journal that a miasma of despair had settled over the ships. It wasn't despair. It was poison, cold, and hunger, a trinity of death. The final straw came with the spring that never was. The sun returned, a weak, pale disk in the sky. But the ice did not melt. It held the ships in a permanent grip. They were not trapped for a season. They were in a frozen tomb. That is when Crozier made the final, fatal decision. They would abandon the ships. They would walk south to a river system hundreds of miles away. It was not a plan. It was a death sentence delivered with a straight face. The men, their minds clouded by lead and desperation, agreed. They began to prepare for the march. And this is where the true madness becomes clear. They didn't just pack food and medicine. They packed the remnants of their old world. They used ropes and pulleys to lower heavy lifeboats onto sledges. And into these boats they loaded silver, plates, forks, spoons, candle holders, an entire officer's dining set. They packed heavy books bound in leather. They packed a mahogany writing desk, a portrait of the king. They were dragging the symbols of their empire into a landscape that cared nothing for kings or silver. Each useless item was a denial of their reality. Each pound of silver was a pound of food they couldn't carry. They were choosing to die with the proper cutlery. The day they left, the ships were silent for the first time in 2 years. 105 survivors stepped onto the ice. A long black line of men against the white. They were thin, sick, and their eyes held a vacant, haunted look. They were pulling their own coffins, filled with treasure. The ice was not flat. It was a jagged hell of broken plates and sharp ridges. The sledges would get stuck. The men would have to unload everything, drag the boat over the ridge, then load it all back up. They made less than a mile a day. At night, they huddled in thin tents as the temperature dropped far below freezing. Men began to die on the march. At first, they buried them, carving graves into the ice with bayonets. Then they stopped. They just left them where they fell. The line of men grew shorter. The paranoia they felt on the ship now had an entire wasteland to fill. They began to split into factions. Men from the HMS Terror stuck together, whispering about the men from the Erebus. They accused them of stealing food during the night. A knife was found in one man's back. No one knew who did it, or no one would say. The march was no longer about survival. It was about suspicion. Every man was an enemy. Every shadow was a threat. They were no longer a crew. They were a pack of starving, poisoned animals turning on each other in the last place on Earth. The line stopped. A man named Gibson, pulling the rope just ahead of the main sledge, collapsed face first into the snow. He didn't make a sound. He just ended. For a full minute, the only sound was the wind whistling over the ice ridges. The other men just stared at the dark shape on the white ground. Captain Crozier, leaning heavily on a walking stick, finally broke the silence. His voice was a dry rasp. "Get him up. Pick him up now." A junior officer, a man named Cornelius Hickey, let out a short, dry laugh. It was a terrible sound in the vast emptiness. His eyes, once clouded with sickness like the rest, were now sharp with a terrifying clarity. The poison had burned away his weakness and left something hard and cold behind. "Why?" Crozier turned, his face a mask of confusion and rage. "He is one of our men, Mr. Hickey. We do not leave our men." Hickey walked to the officer's sledge, the one they all hated, the one filled with dead weight. He kicked it hard. The silver plates inside made a dull, muffled clank. "He is dead weight, sir. Like this." He kicked it again. "And this. He is a corpse. We have enough of those to pull already." The challenge hung in the frozen air. The last thread of discipline, stretched thin over months of darkness and starvation, finally snapped. "That is the Queen's property," Crozier roared, finding a sudden strength. "We are an expedition of the Royal Navy. We will maintain standards." "The Navy is at the bottom of the sea," Hickey shot back, his voice low and steady, cutting through the wind. "Look around you, Captain. There are no queens here. There are no ships. There are only ghosts and bones. Standards? The only standard here is survival." Crozier's hand went to his hip. He drew his service pistol. The metal gleamed a dull gray in the pale light. His hand shook violently, not from the cold, but from the lead poisoning that was liquefying his nerves. "That is mutiny! I will shoot you where you stand." Hickey didn't flinch. He didn't even seem to notice the gun. He slowly unbuttoned his worn coat, revealing a sharpened marlinspike tucked into his belt. He looked past Crozier, his gaze sweeping over the hollowed-out faces of the other men. He spoke to them, not to the captain. "He is going to get you all killed. Look at yourselves. Your teeth are falling out. Your minds are going. And he wants you to die pulling this garbage." He gestured with his chin towards the sledge. "He wants you to die for forks and spoons while your guts rot." He then pointed south into the vast, empty whiteness. "I am walking that way. I am going to find food. I am going to live. Anyone who wants to live will come with me. Anyone who wants to die for a silver teapot can stay here with him." A terrible silence fell. Then a man near the back dropped the rope he was pulling. The thick cord hit the snow with a soft thud. Then another, and another. The sound was an avalanche of descent. They shuffled away from Crozier's sledge, their feet crunching in the snow. They moved towards Hickey. A new pack was forming. A new leader was chosen. "No!" Crozier screamed, his voice thin and cracking. "Form ranks! I am your commander! I order you!" But they didn't listen. They no longer saw a commander. They saw a madman with a pistol, guarding a sledge full of useless metal. Hickey's group, now a dozen strong, moved to the supply sledge. It wasn't a request, it was a raid. One of Crozier's remaining loyalists, a young lieutenant, stepped forward. "Halt! Those are the expedition's rations." Hickey's second-in-command, a whaler with dead eyes, simply shoved the lieutenant to the ground. The officer was too weak to get back up. Hickey's men were methodical. They took the last of the biscuits and the salted meat. They took the remaining gunpowder and the one working rifle. They left Crozier and 5 loyal, terrified men with the silver, the books, and the dead body of Gibson. There was no grand battle, no volley of shots. It was worse. It was a quiet, surgical amputation. As a final act, Hickey walked over to Gibson's body. He knelt down and began unlacing the man's boots. One of Crozier's men cried out, "What are you doing? Have you no decency?" Hickey didn't look up. Decency is a warm meal. He won't be needing these. He pulled the boots free and tossed them to one of his own men, whose feet were wrapped in rags. He then took the man's heavy coat. He stood and faced Crozier one last time. The captain still held the pistol, but his arm had dropped. He looked defeated, broken. "We will take our chances," Hickey said, his voice devoid of all emotion. "You can keep your discipline." Then he and his men turned their backs and began to walk. They didn't look back. The expedition was officially over. What was left were two small groups of starving men, now enemies, lost in the middle of nowhere. One group clinging to the rules of a world that had forgotten them, the other embracing the only rule that was left: survive, no matter the cost. Captain Crozier and his 5 men watched until Hickey's group was just a collection of dark specks against the horizon. Then they were gone. The silence that followed was a physical weight, heavier than the sledge, pressing down from a sky the color of lead. The endless white played tricks on their eyes, creating phantom shapes and false horizons. Crozier's pistol, a symbol of a power that no longer existed, fell from his numb fingers into the snow. The mutiny was over. The real punishment had just begun. They turned back to the sledge, their faces blank masks of exhaustion. The silver gleamed faintly, a cold, indifferent light. It seemed to mock them. They picked up the ropes. The canvas dug into their shoulders. They pulled, one step, then another. The rhythm became their entire world. Pull, step, breathe. They no longer spoke. Words were a currency from a bankrupt world. They were ghosts, haunting the memory of their own expedition. Their only purpose, to drag the symbols of their failure across an endless white desert. The lead in their veins made them docile, compliant in their own slow-motion suicide. A few days later, the last of their food was gone. The young lieutenant, whose name they could barely remember, fell and did not get back up. They stared at him for a moment, then shuffled on. Now there were 4. They kept pulling. The sledge became an altar to their madness. The books, the silver, the discipline, it was all they had left. Eventually, a man dropped a silver candlestick. No one ordered him to. His hands just gave out. It lay there, a bright star in the snow, and they walked on without looking back. They died one by one, leaving a bizarre trail of discarded, useless treasures for the search parties to find years later. A silver fork here, a spoon there, a skeleton in a tattered officer's uniform, its bony fingers still curled around the rope of a sledge that had gone nowhere, a testament to duty in the face of utter annihilation. Hickey's group walked faster, lighter. They were free from the dead weight of command, and for a few days that freedom felt like hope. But they were not free from the hunger gnawing at their insides. The stolen rations lasted less than a week. The rifle was useless. There was no game to hunt. Nothing lived here, except them. When the first of their own group collapsed from exhaustion, a man named Collins, Hickey did not hesitate. The others watched, their faces hollow, as he drew the marlin spike. There was no debate, no vote. Collins tried to speak, but only a dry croak came out. Hickey knelt beside him, and the group formed a tight, silent circle. It was a ritual, the birth of a new and terrible law. There were no more rules of the sea. There was only the rule of the ice. The weak feed the strong. They built a small fire from the wood of a broken crate, the flames a tiny flicker of life in the vast deadness. For the first time in months, they ate until they were full. They were no longer sailors of the Royal Navy. They were something new, something the Arctic had created. But the meat did not last. And the hunger returned, sharper this time, armed with a new and terrible knowledge. They started looking at each other differently. The group split into smaller, silent factions.
Two men would watch a third, their eyes following his every move, waiting for him to stumble, to show weakness. A man who coughed too much at night was a marked man. A man who slept too deeply was a dead man. Survival was no longer a group effort. It was a competition, and Hickey was the undisputed champion, ruling over a dwindling kingdom of fear. The Inuit hunters who had watched the ships get trapped saw them from a distance. They told stories for generations of the Tunit, the white men who had come from the sea. They spoke of seeing a line of them, thin and desperate, dragging a heavy boat. And then they spoke of another group, men with wild eyes who moved like starving wolves, hunting each other under the pale sun that gave no warmth. They found their campsites after they had left.
They found bones, human bones, cracked open for the marrow, skulls with telltale marks of butchery, piles of them, arranged in a way that suggested a grim, repeated ritual. The stories were dismissed for a century as savage fables. They were not. They were eyewitness accounts. Hickey's group did not last the winter. Perhaps they turned on each other until only one remained. Perhaps the last man, a king of a kingdom of bones, simply sat in the snow, surrounded by the evidence of his survival, and waited for the cold to take him. No one knows. The Arctic keeps its secrets. 129 men walked into the ice. None walked out. The ships, Erebus and Terror, were found over a century later, perfectly preserved in the deep, cold water. They sat upright on the seafloor, silent and waiting. They are tombs waiting for bodies that would never return, their cabins filled with the mundane objects of a life abruptly ended. A pair of glasses on a book, plates set for a meal never eaten. All that remains are the whispers, the pristine ghost ships on the seafloor, and the scattered, butchered bones that prove the Inuit stories were true all along. It wasn't the ice that defeated them. It was the poison in their food and the darkness in their own hearts. When civilization was stripped away, they were left with a terrible choice, a choice made for them by a careless factory worker thousands of miles away. Whose side would you have been on? Crozier, who died clinging to the rules that no longer mattered, or Hickey, who abandoned his humanity to survive just one more day? Let us know in the comments below. And if you want to explore more of the darkest corners of history, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss our next investigation into the abyss.